Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward podcast with myself, Chris Tuck, and my co-host,
Beverley Ann.
And today we have got a lovely person come onto the podcast. Means a lot to me personally. And this episode we are calling IICSA Special Edition Part 3. And we have the lovely John O'Brien on the show with us today. So, John, can you tell everybody that's listening or watching who you are and a little bit about your life growing up? So just so we can get to know a little bit about you.
Okay. So my name's John O'Brien, and I recently retired, but I ended my career after spending 8 years as secretary to the IICSA inquiry. I grew up in rural North Cornwall in a community where everybody knew each other. So I was lucky. I had a very easy childhood. There were always people to talk to about things. There were always people that looked out for you. So it was a village of about, 300 people, something like that. But one of the negatives of that is that when you're a 16-year-old, that is very boring. There's nothing to do. Mm-hmm. So I was quite anxious to leave that environment and try something different. So after A levels, I had a generous mother who agreed to fund for me a gap year, which turned into a gap 2.5 year.
Brilliant.
And then I was in South America when I got a message from her that said, "Time to come home."
Oh, wow.
So I had a great time traveling largely around. I did Australia and South America, went to quite a lot of countries in South America, then came back and decided at that point that there was no point in doing university. So I was lucky enough to get a job with one of the big accountancy firms, where I quickly moved into consultancy. And I did a number of degrees as I moved through that process to try and make up for not going to university. So I was casting around for what do I do next, and I saw an advertisement for the director of the Criminal Records Bureau, and I thought, well, that looks interesting. So I now know, but didn't know at that point, that this was July 2002, and I now know that the Criminal Records Bureau launched in March 2002 and had quickly fallen over. And so they'd advertised for somebody externally to come in and try and put it right. All of my colleagues thought I was crazy going to the public sector, but I thought it was perhaps quite a worthwhile thing to do. So to cut a long story short, I applied for and got the role, but I got a rude awakening. Because I think for those people that don't know, the Criminal Records Bureau was designed to provide a one-stop shop to get criminal record information for what we now call regulated activity. So those that want to work with children or vulnerable adults, whereas previously people had to go to each individual force to get the information that force held. It was decided to bring it together in one shop. So it launched in the March, and by the June, there were backlogs everywhere, and it was unable to process claims in time. So I arrived at Liverpool Station on the day that I was due to take up my role, and the first 3 taxi drivers refused to take me because lots of their colleagues had been affected by the fact that they couldn't get their criminal records checks and were unable to work.
Oh.
So I had to
to make enemies straight away.
So I walked halfway and finally found a taxi to get me to the office. And then as I approached the office, there was this whole phalanx of reporters wanting to ask me how I was going to fix it.
Wow, that's
so I
pressure.
sort of rushed through those and said, it's day one, a little bit early to tell. So the essence of the problem at the Criminal Records Bureau was it was always intended to be a digital process, one of the early adopters of digital. At the very last minute, everybody realised that wouldn't be possible because the technology wasn't working. So they decided to shift it to paper-based. which might seem a good decision on the face of things, but there's no point in deciding to launch paper-based if you haven't got all the structure behind it that would deal with that. That's what they've done, essentially. So it took me 3 months to work through what the issues were and put a plan in place to get it fixed. In the interim, we were now into September, and there were schools all around the country that could not open because of this backlog.
Wow,
now,
I don't remember any of this.
Yeah, there were schools that couldn't open around the country. Now, that was clearly a problem for children's education, but it was also a problem because some children were being left in environments at home that were unsafe.
Yeah.
So it was a big problem. And the law said that nobody that required a disclosure in their day-to-day role could work unless they had a disclosure. So if a school couldn't get disclosures, it couldn't open. And it wasn't just schools that were affected, but schools were the most affected organisations overall by this. So I then had to go down to London to present the plan to ministers, long and short of which is we required 6 months to clear the backlog, which by that point was standing at 102,000 applications, a figure that's burned forever in my brain. Essentially, what we did is we got help from all sorts of civil service departments in Liverpool. We ring-fenced the backlog. We then dealt with the incoming work and made sure we stayed on top of the incoming work so that we didn't just create a new backlog. And through the 6 months, we worked through that backlog. A couple of days before the expiry of that 6 month deadline, we were back on track. So that was my first experience of the civil service. So that was, we were now into April, May 2003. And I then happily hummed along at the Criminal Records Bureau for a while. But then tragically, Holly and Jessica in Soham occurred. And there was as you know, a report by Michael Bichard into what should happen, and he issued over 30 recommendations. And I was asked if I'd like to go down from the Criminal Records Bureau to the Home Office to lead the Home Office response to Michael Bichard's recommendations, which I did. For me personally, the most important of those from my perspective was the need to fix the gap that had allowed Holly and Jessica's situation to occur, which was the lack of a system to allow forces to share local intelligence data with each other. They could share national data, criminal data, but not local intelligence. And so we put together a system for the Criminal Records Bureau to use, because it was essentially be the Criminal Records Bureau's job to provide this information, where because of the real difficulty in converting data from paper records and all sorts of other sources on a national scale, and then converting that to a system that the Criminal Records Bureau could use, we simply took what we called the identifying data, so name, date of birth, addresses in the last 5 years, and built a system around that, which meant that forces could identify if another force held information, but they couldn't identify what the information was, but they knew somebody had it.
Yeah.
So that might seem a really quite in-depth précis of my career with the Criminal Records Bureau, but there is a point to it, because
there is,
in all of that, I became quite passionate about the need to draw things that didn't appear to be connected to ensure the safety of people together, so that things that did need to be connected started to be connected. So although I went back to the Criminal Records Bureau for 5 or 6 months after we'd finished delivering on the Home Office share of the Bichard recommendations, I was then asked to go down to the Home Office to start building what we would now call a safeguarding area, or I think at the time it was described as a public protection area. But this was essentially about identifying where in government issues relating to the safety of children and vulnerable adults was dealt with, and trying to rationalise whether it was sensible for it to stay where it was, or whether we should rationalise chunks of work together in one place, so that you could really start to build on that knowledge and understanding being in one place, and individuals would start to really understand more about the whole picture rather than they're just part of the picture. So that did lead to the Home Office taking on responsibility for some areas that we would now describe as safeguarding from from health and from education. And it also involved bits that the Home Office did going to largely to education, actually. But it was a rationalisation of what was sensible. So that was what I did for about the first 18 months in the Home Office. And then, as you know, in 2010, there was an election when the coalition government came in, and they wanted, one of their early priorities was to have a review of the vetting and barring system, which underpinned the Criminal Records Bureau, because by that point, there were 33 million posts in the UK that were potentially subject to disclosure regime. And that was in danger. That was in danger of beginning to work against itself, because it was becoming very onerous, and it was leaving large gaps whilst employers went through the process as staff moved on of getting that. So I then led the team that, the policy team that put together the changes that appeared in the Protection of Freedoms Bill in 2012 to rationalise that system, to modernise it to a certain extent, which did lead to fewer people being checked, but it was largely people that in the work environment were supervised anyway.
Yeah.
People that were supervised were checked, but the people that were doing the supervising were checked, but there wasn't necessity to have the people that were constantly supervised. And that just, it's always a delicate balance, but it is one example of where you do have to balance it. In some ways, it would be obvious to say check everybody, but it was genuinely working in the opposite direction because it was slowing the whole system down so much.
Yeah.
It wasn't helping people. So it was a rationalization of the system. And that really got me into thinking about how you might do this under ways. So a year or two later, I was asked to apply for the role of Director of Safeguarding in the Home Office, which I did. And that allowed me to do that with a more strategic view. So I was no longer doing all the doing. I wasn't leading the program teams that put computer systems together, but I was thinking about how you might further rationalise, improve the lines of communication between government departments and things like the police and social services, all the sorts of things that would allow a system to talk to each other better. So things like MASH hubs and all those sorts of things was the sorts of things we really started to think about in serious ways during that period. So that was all really about trying to rationalise the safeguarding landscape, because then you've got a better baseline to build on for the future. So nobody would pretend it's perfect now, but it did give a baseline that we could build on.
And it stops that silo working, doesn't it?
It does.
When you've got clearer communication pathways and you've got that the strategy looking over everything, as you said.
Yeah, and it's a very easy thing to say, but taking entrenched systems and changing them dramatically takes time.
Wow, of course it does. Particularly
when you're working across different government departments. So we're now into 2013/2014, and suddenly the Jimmy Savile affair erupted onto the public consciousness. And so I was involved in helping the Met there set up their Operation U-Tree response to Jimmy Savile, which was just incredible. I can't remember the exact figures, but I do remember that the number of calls going to Operation U-Tree was, nobody could believe the number of calls that were being received in response to that. And it became obvious quite soon from the correspondence that we were receiving in the Home Office at that point that it had really galvanised survivors of child sexual abuse to start to demand an inquiry.
Yeah.
Now, it is true to say that governments like to explore every option for improving things before they go to an inquiry. And so it took us a while to work through the issues of, do we think we can fix this internally and quickly, internally within government, or do we actually need an inquiry on this? But the level of correspondence that was coming in just continued to grow. So there was an initially agreement, and I should explain here a bit of really quite complex government machinery, is that if you want to do anything in government, the department that is responsible for the policy area, so in this case, the Home Office, has to do what they call a write around. So they have to write around to every other cabinet minister's office and say, we would like to do this, and we would like your agreement to that. And it isn't until you can say that you have the agreement of all other ministers that the policy can then go forward. And that is the whole point in a democracy of collective cabinet responsibility. So it's a good thing because it makes sure everybody is bought into it. And through that process, it was decided that we would launch a non-statutory inquiry. Now,
okay. Can we just hold you there for 1 minute? Bev, what do you want to say?
My question there, I'm thinking about our listeners, this is, I've just got a devil's advocate, really. So what if 2 or 3 say, well, I'm not really sure that it's, viable?
So I skipped around all that. You deal with that. You deal with the questions that come in as you go through, and you get to the point where you do have that collective agreement. It doesn't always happen that everybody writes back and says yes, but your job is to make sure that at the end of the day, everybody has said yes if you're the lead policy official. So we worked through all that, and we got to the point where we got a non-statutory inquiry. Now, this has been fairly well documented in the press, so I'll just, but I think it's worth repeating. It was not popular that it was non-statutory because, of course, you can't compel witnesses to give evidence in a non-statutory inquiry, and quite rightly, survivors thought that was essential to get to the bottom of what had happened. And then, as you know, there was lots of press focus at the time on who knew whom in the government world, and that was all related to would they be suitable to be a chair if they knew people that at that time there were rumours that were involved in abuse. And we now know there were lots of people who were rumoured to be involved in abuse who just weren't, but at the time. And so that was that unfortunately led to the first 2 chairs of that non-statutory inquiry having to step down because of relationships with people that the press thought might well be associated with child sexual abuse at that time.
But it's not only that, John, it was the trust of the victim and survivors, wasn't it? Because that's when I met you back then, changing the inquiry from non-statutory to statutory. Okay. And it was because in order for the victim and survivor to be on board and involved, the trust had to be there. And so you saying what you did about those 2 chairs is fine, but at the time, the trust wasn't there, and any conflict of interest was not taken on board by victims and survivors. So it was really important that we did have that trust with you and you with us. Yeah,
I mean, it is true to say that when it was decided to have a non-statutory inquiry, at that point there had been no reaching out to the victim and survivor community to ask their views on that. It was just decided that was what we would do. In hindsight, I wish I could go back and try and unpick that, but that's what happened.
Yeah.
I'll come on later to talk about some of the reasons why I think that happened, but it did happen. And it very quickly became obvious that even if we found a chair that was able to be entirely disassociated from links with people about whom allegations were made, but later proven, I think it is important to say that those allegations were later proved to be unfounded, that there was a recognition in government that needed to be made statutory. And so that decision was made. That was the start of a whole raft of new problems. So we then did start to reach out to victims and survivors. I have to say here, the Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, recognised immediately that we needed to engage the victim and survivor community. And to make sure we did that, she was very keen that she personally was involved in some of that consultation. So we arranged 4 meetings with different groups of adult victim survivors that Theresa May attended and chaired to make sure she heard those views. And then we also arranged a one meeting, because it was much more difficult to arrange and manage, with child victims of they were still children, so they were current child victims at that time abuse, which she also attended. But as you can imagine, that was wrapped around with all sorts of support and guidance and advocates in attendance. But she listened very hard, I think, through that process. And the reason I labour that, it did start in people's mind, this process that, as strange as it seems now, consultation with victims and survivors was going to be key to making this inquiry a success, which is what I was referring to earlier when I said I'd come back to some of the reasons for this. Government, not in a malicious way, has a habit of making its mind up and then moving to do stuff. And I think that's what happened with the initial non-statutory inquiry. It moved from, we don't really want to do this, to we need to do this, and it just did it. It was not malicious. I can genuinely say, from being in the middle of it, it was not malicious, but it was unhelpful. It didn't lead to the building of trust. But that's it. I think we need to be honest about these things. It was trying its best to move quickly, and in that process, there was a lot of learning.
It was more of a means to an end, wasn't it, rather than understanding the actual appetite for what was needed, I think.
It was. In hindsight, yes, it was. But all I would say is I think it was genuine. They thought, the level of activity we're receiving requesting this now is so great, let's just do it. And they didn't think of the consequences of going straight from we're not sure to let's just do it without anything in the middle. And so we then got to the point where we did have a statutory inquiry. We had agreement to a statutory inquiry, having gone through the process I described of right around to other government departments. And we consulted in those meetings I described to you on the type of person that survivors might want as a chair, and the overwhelming, in fact, it might almost have been unanimous, but it was certainly the overwhelming feedback is we wanted to be a judge. Now, this caused us an issue because you have to get the permission of the Lord Chief Justice in England if you want a serving or retired judge to be the chair of an inquiry. And there had been an undertaking given after the dissolution of the non-statutory inquiry that the nominated chair of the statutory inquiry would go before the parliamentary committee so that they could ask him or her questions. The Lord Chief Justices in all three jurisdictions in the UK quite rightly therefore refused to allow for a UK judge to be in that, because having a judge, retired or otherwise, appearing before Parliament breaches the war that exists between the executive and the judiciary. You've essentially got members of the executive questioning a member of the judiciary, and that is, we have a real war between those things in all democracies, so that the judiciary is independent of the executive. And so those were very understandable reasons. So we had to cast our net further afield. We had to look at Commonwealth countries. The reason we looked at Commonwealth countries is simply because their judicial systems are all built on the basis of the UK system. They may differ slightly, but they're all built on that basis. And we therefore alighted on a New Zealand judge who then took the chair and took the inquiry through its first year and a bit. Now, I'm sure many of your listeners will have seen in the press the consequences of what happened later in that process. That was largely down to two things. When an inquiry is set up, I think it will be a surprise to your listeners to know that you have to build the entire infrastructure from scratch. There is nothing sitting on the shelf. So to try and bring that to life, I was asked if I'd come across and be secretary. And I arrived in the building that had been used for the non-statutory inquiry, which by its nature would have been much smaller. And so was quite a small space. There were 5 staff. There was no dedicated IT. There was Wi-Fi in only one room. There were no desks. And the rest of the space was filled with the junk from other tenants in the building. And so you have to do everything. You have to work out how you're going to get the space configured. You have to order the furniture. And government doesn't have a magic wand on all this sort of stuff. You have to wait for the furniture to arrive.
No doubt put it together.
No.
Oh,
We were lucky. We didn't have to go flat pack, but you still have to wait for it to arrive. You have to order the IT and you are a customer in the queue. So for instance, in order to get the secure Wi-Fi link installed was a 6-week wait.
wow.
I'm only saying these as demonstrations of you don't just click your fingers and make it happen.
And there was a lot of stuff at the time where people were going, well, when's the inquiry going to start? When's it going to get up and going? When are we going to, be involved? And it's all because this infrastructure had to be set up from scratch.
Indeed. And I was absolutely determined as secretary that it would have been absolutely fatal to the inquiry if it had tried to make do and launched and collapsed and fell over because its IT didn't work. And I'll talk about some of the dangers of that in a moment. But I was absolutely determined we weren't going to do that. It was I had very few red lines, but that was one of them. When we launched, there might be many reasons why we got into difficulties with, the way we investigate on things, but we couldn't fail because our IT couldn't cope or because we didn't have sufficiently trained staff. But you then also have to decide, because we were an independent inquiry, I felt it was very important that we designed the HR process and we interviewed personally all the staff we were going to recruit. Now, obviously, a lot of those staff were seconded in from government departments, but I felt it important that they weren't just seconded to us, that we went through a process of interviewing people and making sure that we felt they were right. Now, having said that, there is almost nowhere that would prepare you for all the sorts of things you need to have an inquiry, but you need to have people with the basic skills that can be built upon. And so we then had to start interviewing for staff to start. There was then quite a laborious process of negotiating with government departments to release them to come to the inquiry. So I thought you needed a year to 15 months to get that up and running, a major part of which was buying the IT system. Now, one of the things we needed to do was estimate how much evidence we were going to get. And I thought it was best to err on let's pick the biggest reasonable figure that we think we might get, because it's better to have a system that's got too much capacity rather than one that had too little. And in an inquiry, particularly one like IICSA, where there was no time limit going backwards, so we could go back as far as people came to speak to us. There was no limit on what types of institutions. The terms of reference were public and private, so any institution. I just felt we might get a lot of evidence. So we thought we should allow for 10 million individual pages of A4. And the way you have to search data is quite unique, because you may get, I'm just making these names up, Fred, who's 76 in Surrey, and Mabel, who's 52 in Northumberland, both talking to you a year apart about the same institution, 20 years apart. Does that make sense? And you have to be able to match those things immediately so you can start to collate the evidence and the information you're getting. So we couldn't just buy an off-the-shelf system. We had to buy an off-the-shelf system and then bespoke it.
Wow.
So that's probably enough detail, but this is all why you cannot just launch
a long time.
John, can I just go back, because we're very involved in this, and this is where, when we use acronyms, some of our listeners may be new to this. And IICSA is the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse.
It is.
So I just want to make that clear for anyone listening thinking, what's IICSA? Because we know, and it becomes so familiar. So Indeed. Thank you. And explaining this process, even myself, I'm like, wow, I didn't actually understand. You assume, and I know they say never assume, but when it's like it's going ahead, well, there you go, there's the office, there's a system, get on with it.
Yep. So
wow, John.
So if I just pick the office, in the consultation with survivors that we did early on, the feedback was, please don't be in a government building. Please don't be in a building where, when survivors come to visit you, they might be traumatized because it's with a local authority in there. So we had to find a neutral space. All of these things take time, is my point. And Chris hit the nail right on the head earlier when she said, of course, the press started to say, well, why aren't you starting to hear evidence? Now, the main reason was definitely because we were still building the infrastructure. But it's also fair to say that the judge from New Zealand, Justice Goddard, was by this time experienced just how difficult it is to have a home in New Zealand and run an inquiry 12,000 miles away. And I think, you know, it was clear that she was finding that a challenge at that point. No, that's not a criticism. It was just a fact. You know, her family was all based in New Zealand. She had young grandchildren in New Zealand. She was finding it increasingly difficult to spend large parts of her life in the UK. It's not an hour's trip to get home. It's a 2-day round trip, if not longer. And so at that point, Justice Goddard, we're now into early 2016, indicated that she wished to return to New Zealand. So next challenge is that we had just started at that point. We'd just had the opening statement. We were on the cusp of starting to request evidence. So it was really important that momentum was maintained. I think given all we'd gone through, if we'd lost momentum and we'd had a 6-month hiatus while we recruited a new chair, I feared that might be the final straw in terms of survivors and public patients. So the only way you can recruit a chair quickly is we were lucky enough right at the start to decide that we needed a panel to assist the chair because of the sheer nature and scale of the inquiry. You can ask one of the existing panel members whether they'd be prepared to step up, and because they've already been through a recruitment process to be a panel member, you can do that. You cannot do it. You cannot just offer it to somebody outside of that process, if that makes sense. So Alexis Jay, who had been a panel member, in my view, at huge risk to herself, because by this point, there was a negative story every day in the press about IICSA, if more. I think she stepped up to the mark and agreed that she would become chair. There was then a period where the inquiry, I think, went dark for a month or two, while we went into a huddle to decide how we're going to take this forward. I think that was a useful period because the major thing that came out of that huddle was that we would investigate, not in the traditional way an inquiry investigates, where we heard evidence about everything, and at the end we just published one big report. We decided we would do it in strands so that we could publish reports as we went along. And all I mean by strands is the health sector, the education sector, whatever the sector was, we would look at that sector in depth. And then when we were finished with that sector, we'd publish reports about that sector and move on to the next sector. And that did two things, which I think were crucial for IICSA, but potentially are useful to other inquiries as well. If you publish reports about individual sectors as you go along, you can also publish recommendations as you go along. And it means that you are still around as an inquiry to prod, remind, ask why those recommendations haven't been implemented. And so if we look at the 87 odd recommendations we made during that process, nearly 86% of them were implemented by the time IICSA wrapped up. And I'm talking about the strand reports now, not the final report. So you've got quite a high compliance rate with the recommendations that were made through that process of issuing strand reports. But it also meant
15 publications, John, wasn't it?
15.
Sorry for interrupting.
It was actually 19 publications because some of the strands had more than one report. So the Catholic Church and the Church of England had more than one report. And then we had an interim report as well, which was a sort of halfway state of the nation report. But the other thing it does, and I'm unashamed about this, it allows you, every time you publish a report, to invite the press to come and talk to you about it. And so it keeps the subject matter in the general public consciousness. It keeps that focus on the subject matter. It keeps the reason why you exist alive. Otherwise, I think there was a danger. The IICSA inquiry lasted for 8 years. To the general public, if all you do they hear about you in the blaze of publicity when you start up, by the time you come to the end, in the general public consciousness is a danger that everybody's forgotten about you. So I think it was really important through the process to be able to do that publicity as we went through. You know, the press were great. It was on front page of papers. It was on, you know, 6 o'clock news. It was on Sky News. It really kept the subject matter in the public consciousness.
But as you was working through them, John, you also came across a lot of cross-cutting themes, didn't you, when you worked on one sector to another sector? Can you explain to people what we mean by that?
Yeah, so by cross-cutting themes, all we mean is where through the individual strands, we identified things that had gone wrong that applied across the piece. In every strand we looked at, there were things that had gone wrong. And you could just say, this was one of the factors in, by the time you got to the final report, you could say this was one of the factors in every strand we looked at. So, you know, a move to protect the reputation of the organization was a common thread we found once institutions start to investigate. They started to close down the sharing of information with external agencies because of this desire to protect their reputation. Was just an example of one of those cross-cutting themes. We found that in almost every case we looked at, that at some point in that process, there was a clear move that could only have been designed to keep it internal, if I can put it like that.
Whilst we're on this cross-cutting theme, there are many victim survivors out there that were saying, why isn't IICSA looking at my institution or that institution? And it was because of this cross-cutting themes. Can you just add a little bit about that?
It was for 2 reasons. One is that you have to be careful when you launch an inquiry, that however big the task, that you complete it as soon as you think you've heard all the evidence you need. And that's not to denigrate at all the experience of individuals, in this case of child sexual abuse. But as soon as you've got all the evidence, I feel that you're duty bound to publish that evidence and say, this is what government now needs to do about this. Because your ultimate role as an inquiry, whatever your subject matter, is to say, let's start doing the things that will stop it happening. And so through that process, because of the cross-cutting themes, you start to hear individual evidence, which is very compelling, but doesn't actually anything new to the overall evidence base from the things you've heard about those cross-cutting themes from the other 500 witnesses that have given you information about that. So you have to start saying to yourself, we now need to balance. Do we hear from another 5,000 people from a range of different institutions, or can we now confidently say that we've heard so much evidence about this particular institution that we know what we need to do about it? And those are the rules, if you like. They're not really rules, but those are the standards we applied when we thought we've now heard this evidence. What we're hearing now is a repeat of things that we heard 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago. It's incumbent on inquiry at that point to do it, because an inquiry's role is never to hear every single piece of evidence. Any terms of reference say, basically, I'm paraphrasing, get to the root of the problem and tell us what you need to do to solve it.
Yes.
We could have happily gone on for 20 years in the scope of IICSA. But at some point you have to say, we simply have enough now.
We've heard.
Job.
Yeah.
And I do want to say publicly, I understand how difficult that is for some people. It was actually difficult for those of us that worked in the inquiry, because as we went through this, we got much better at understanding how victims and survivors and those that had worked in these institutions that were ashamed of how the institution had acted felt about us not being able to hear their voice.
Yeah.
But ultimately, my job and the job of everybody in the inquiry was to put it right. And so literally after 7 years, the evidence was beginning to repeat itself. And, I just wish to repeat, that doesn't take away from individuals' experience, but it does mean that we've got sufficient evidence to publish what we need to publish about whatever it is. So through IICSA, that's what we did. We adopted this strand approach. Now, there may be some people unfortunate enough who are watching this podcast to realize that whenever IICSA popped up on the news, it was my face on the news, and why was it me and not a panel member or the chair? And there is a really good reason for that, which is I didn't hear the evidence. My job as secretary as a term is a bit like permanent secretary, not in rank, but in terms of what you do in a department. It's essentially the CEO. So my job was to make sure that the organisation was able to support the panel, that we had everything we needed, that we had set timeframes to do and keep everybody on track. My job was not to hear the evidence. That was not my area of expertise. That's why we had a chair and a panel. But when you hear the evidence and you write your reports, if you quote a piece of, if you say something, you must be able to underpin it with evidence. So if the chair or a panel member had been in a TV interview where it's, you know, you're asked a question, you have 3 seconds to think about it.
Yeah.
You say something and the evidence doesn't support that, somebody could potentially at that point launch a judicial review against the inquiry, which would mean whichever hearing you were in at that point would have to be delayed whilst that judicial review was heard, and that would have delayed the whole inquiry. So if anybody ever wonders, was it because the chair didn't want to do that? That was not the case at all. It was so that we didn't run the risk that in the heat of the moment, when you've got an interviewer's asking you a question and you need to give an answer quickly, that you didn't inadvertently say something that wasn't backed up by the evidence.
Bev?
I've just got to tell you, we've got 5 more minutes because time is ticking on, and this is fantastic. Well, I'm just letting you know, because I'm so absorbed, you know, as a victim survivor myself, and hearing this side, John, really, it's mind-blowing.
We can speed up or continue beyond the 45. It's up to you.
Yeah, we'll continue. Carry on, John.
Okay. So that we then we hit COVID, and of course, one of the things that victims and survivors and others really like about an inquiry is that if they wish, they can come and either give evidence in person in a hearing, or they can come and sit in a hearing as a member of the audience, if I can put it like that, and they can watch people in the institutions giving the evidence in person, having to explain themselves about why they did whatever they did. When COVID struck, we had 2 choices. We either delay the inquiry until all the restrictions were lifted, or we move it online. Now, because we've never had in our lifetimes an issue that affected the nation in a way that COVID did, there was no precedent for an inquiry ever holding entirely online meetings. And everybody that's involved in that, giving evidence on both sides, has to agree to that. It can't just be the chair that decides that. So we had to write to all the people that were due to be witnesses and all the hearings that were still due to go on, and ask them if they'd like to hold them online or in person. Now, I think it was a good thing that everybody said, let's just get on with it. Because as it turned out, that would have delayed us for 18 months to 2 years. And I think that would have been a shame for the reasons I think
it would have been a death knell, John. Again, anything that stops it in its tracks would have been awful.
It would, and it would also have led to a 2-year delay in just getting the recommendations out. But I do acknowledge, the reason for saying that, I do acknowledge that it did rob people of the ability to look people in the eye and say it. But I do think on balance, it was the right thing to do. Because I do think it enabled us to get on, conclude the inquiry. We were by then 3/4 of the way through it. And I think it would have been a shame to delay it. But and then the other thing about COVID is that I had to make a decision. In this case, it was me, because it was a sort of CEO secretary type thing, as to what the conditions were that our staff were going to work in during COVID. So just a couple of weeks prior to the actual official shutdown, I decided that all staff should work from home. And I decided that because if we were going to go to online hearings, I felt it was better for staff for all sorts of reasons. Some staff had partners that were vulnerable, and that would have put them in an awkward situation. But actually, if I could reduce the likelihood that staff were going to be exposed to COVID, they would feel better in themselves. And it would also mean that we maximise our chances of being able to get on with the inquiry online. So that's the reason why actually IICSA itself essentially went to a working from home requirement in late February of that year rather than the March when the official one was done. And it's also why we went to online hearings, so that we could just get on with things. So that really brought us to the end of IICSA. It delayed us by about 4 months, no longer, that just while we made all the technical adjustments to doing that.
This is the end of part 1. If you have any questions, please contact us on breakingthecycle2stepforward@gmail.com. Part 2 is available next week.